Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about Rome and how it transitioned from a republic to an empire. So Rome began as a monarchy around 800 BCE, and if you look at the map, you can see that Italy was all divided up. It was not united like it is today. And Rome started as a monarchy with really just the city of Rome, like a city-state. Eventually, it transitioned to a republic around 509 BCE. A republic, it's important to understand that term. So a republic is any government where some people can vote and there's no king. So it's representative, but that doesn't mean that it's a democracy. It could be a democracy, but in Rome's case, it's not. So they had two consuls who were the executives and a senate, which is pictured here, which was made up of 300 patricians who held their positions for life. So it's representative in the sense that those patricians can vote, but everyone else in Rome could not. Rome was divided into two main social classes. The patricians were the wealthy landowners who dominated the Senate, so that's like the aristocracy. The plebeians are everyone else, so commoners with no political voice. And eventually, through several different revolts, the plebeians gained the right to have tribunes and councils to make decisions for themselves, but they were never able to be in the Senate or have a real voice for the whole of Rome. So again, we want to make sure we understand that the Roman Republic, although some of the consuls held power and the patricians held power, it was definitely not a democracy. Rome overall is really known for the rule of law. The 12 tables in 450 BCE are a code of law that you can see in the picture here, were designed to protect ordinary people. And they had some things that are similar to what we have today. For example, if you're accused of something, you can go before a court, like you see in the picture on the left, and defend yourself and present evidence and witnesses. And so they're supposed to be based on common sense and fairness for everyone. Rome is really known for the rule of law, whereas in China, classical China, they relied on the bureaucracy and the scholar bureaucrats to help keep order. In Rome, they really believed that having a good set of laws would keep order. So Rome started out as that tiny city-state and eventually conquered all of Italy like you see on the map. They built up a large military and decided to go after other people controlling areas of the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars, which are a series of wars that Rome fought against Carthage, are what's pictured on this map. So the dark brown area is the Carthage Empire. Rome really wanted to get more farmland to support their empire, so that's one motivation. They also wanted to control the area around the Mediterranean for trade purposes, so that's another motivation. So this is just one example of the wars that Rome fought for expansion over time. So as Rome expanded its territory, it ran into some political issues because the generals who were responsible for conquering that new territory and waging war became very powerful. A lot of them became very well known and known as heroes for everything that they had done, and their army started to become loyal to the general rather than to Rome. And so this kind of sparked the generals wanting to seize power for themselves. And so civil wars between powerful leaders led to the first triumvirate. A triumvirate is when three people share equal power. And if you think about that, if these generals are used to being in charge, that's not really going to work out, that they're going to want to share power with other people. And so out of the first triumvirate, eventually those three people went to war against each other, and Julius Caesar, who was a well-known general, was victorious and established himself as dictator. About a year later, you can see in the painting on the right, he was actually stabbed to death by the senators. The story is that they kind of tricked him into going into the Senate, that they had to meet about something, and they're waiting there for him to murder him. The reason for this is that they were upset that power had been taken away from the Senate because Rome had become a dictatorship, whereas previously it had been a republic. So after Julius Caesar's death, there was a period of conflict, and then they tried the same thing again. A second triumvirate formed. The same thing happened. Those different people went to war against each other, and Octavian emerged victorious. Octavian is pictured here. When he became emperor, he assumed the title Augustus, which means revered one, and he emerged victorious, defeating the rest of the second triumvirate. The age of Augustus is known as a time of great expansion of territory and culture. You can see on the map all of the green territory was what the Roman Empire consisted of during the reign of Augustus. And so this started the Pax Romana, which is a 200-year period of peace and prosperity. A lot of the things that we know the Roman Empire for, like their building projects, like here we see the Colosseum, roads, and wars of expansion, occurred during the Pax Romana. And it's called that because Pax means peace, and then Romana, Rome, so it's a period of relative peace within the empire. This map shows you the greatest extent of the empire ever, so I want you to take a minute and look at this. You can see Italy. To the east of that, you see Greece. Keep going east, you see Turkey, parts of the Middle East, Jerusalem, Egypt, all the way across North Africa. We come back up into Spain, France, parts of Germany, and even parts of Britain. So it's a very large empire. So now we're going to talk about how the Roman Empire kept control of this very large empire. All citizens between the ages of 17 and 46 who owned land were required to serve in the Roman legions. The legions are small, well-organized fighting forces, so they were required to serve in the military. A large army is necessary to maintain the expanding empire. This is something that's true of all of the major classical empires we've learned, like Han China and Gupta India and now the Roman Empire. They have great success expanding territory, but that causes issues eventually, because when you have a larger and larger territory, you have to defend that. Also, if you're conquering more and more people, not everybody wants to be conquered. You're going to have rebellion, and so you need a larger and larger military as your empire grows. There were also economic changes, so many small farmers sold their land to wealthy patricians who made giant farms. So agriculture became more commercialized. The Romans were known for some new military technology, pictured here. So on the left, we have the catapult. They are also known for siege devices, such as battering rams, like pictured on the left or on the right. So this would be used for something like trying to break through a wall or a door. A siege is where you basically surround a place and kind of attack them until they're forced to come out, or cut off food supplies or something like that until they're forced to come out. So think about like the siege of the Alamo. That's what these kinds of things would be used for. Another really important tool that the Romans used to maintain control is their road system. You can see on the picture on the left, this is a road, Roman road that is still in existence today, about 2,000 years later. On the map on the right, you can see over 50,000 miles of roads were built. So these were used for trade and transportation, but this really helped with defense too, because as the Roman Empire expanded and had more issues that they had to deal with, like rebellions in outer areas and things like that, they needed to be able to move their military plus all their equipment very quickly. And so when you have a good road system where you can have wheeled vehicles travel more easily, that really aided the military to be able to get where it needed to go. The Romans also had environmental issues. So deforestation, there's lots of reasons this occurred, and you can just put down a few examples. Number one, most of their buildings were built out of wood, so they cut down trees for that. Number two, about 90% of their fuel for heat, metalworking, came from wood. Agriculture increased as the population increased, and so they cleared more land to farm. They grazed a lot of animals, and we've talked about that before. When you overgraze and the vegetation goes away, it'll lead to soil erosion and things like that. The military sometimes cut down forests to prevent sneak attacks. Also, the Romans were big in Mediterranean trade, sailing around the Mediterranean, and so they used lots of wood for ships. And high populations of cities like Rome devastated the surrounding forests because they cut down trees to build buildings and to heat homes and things like that. So what's the impact of all this? It's the same as we've talked about in other places. Overused farmland led to soil depletion, erosion of land, and flooding due to erosion. So once we have erosion, and say you have an area that previously had a lot of vegetation and now it doesn't, when it rains, it's much easier for it to flood because there's not as much vegetation to stop and soak up that water. So once Rome became an empire, it allowed a lot of local control. So as they conquered all these different groups of people, they generally were tolerant of people's customs and religion. Now there's one caveat to this, is that they required that people practice the Roman religion, but they can add other religions to it. Now the Romans had the same gods as the Greeks, they just made their names into Latin. So they were polytheistic originally. And most of the people that they conquered were polytheistic, and so it wasn't too much of a stretch. So the Romans would say, you're already polytheistic, you just need to also worship our gods, and then we'll let you kind of do what you want. And that worked pretty well. They also depended on their military and laws to keep order in such a large empire. Now, allowing people to keep their religion is a positive in terms of rule, because people are less likely to rebel if you let them kind of keep doing their own thing and they don't feel like everything is changing. So that's a definite tactic and a political choice to do that, to try to maintain order. The picture here represents the one main challenge to that, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So during the classical period, Judaism was centered around Jerusalem, and the Jewish leaders codified their scriptures, and we've talked about that word before. Codified or codification means it became standardized, like this is what Jews believe. The Romans captured Jerusalem in 37 BCE, and Jewish revolts against Roman rule occurred. So I said on the last slide that the Romans were tolerant of religion, but you had to also worship the Roman gods. Well, the Jews were never going to do this because they're monotheistic. And so they refused to worship the Roman gods, and the Romans didn't like that. And so this eventually caused the diaspora, where Jews fled the Middle East and moved to more hospitable areas, or just areas where there weren't as high a concentration of Jews that kind of drew attention of the Romans. And we're going to talk more about Judaism in class and the history of Judaism, and as well as the different struggles that they encountered throughout their history. So that'll be in class sometime soon. This is a map of the diaspora. So if you look on the bottom right where you see Jerusalem, so that's where Judaism pretty much originated and where the temple was and holy places for Judaism. You can see here that after these attacks by the Romans, the Jews left that area, a lot of them did, and traveled throughout Europe, into North Africa, and into the Middle East. So diaspora means scattering. They went out and scattered to all different places. Another way that Rome tried to maintain control was to keep people happy in the cities. Rome was a very large city, and there were a lot of people who lived in poverty, and so they gave away free food and entertainment to the poor. The term for this is bread in circuses, bread meaning giving away free food, circuses. A circus is actually what you see here, the Circus Maximus, is a racetrack where they had chariot races. They also, in the Colosseum, had all kinds of entertainment, gladiators who fought each other to the death, things like that. The Romans tended to enjoy things that were really bloody and gory. They found that very entertaining. A lot of the people outside of major cities were pretty far removed from politics and all the cultural achievements of the city of Rome. Most were farmers. Initially, a lot of them were independent farmers, so they owned their own land. Later, I said in an earlier slide, a lot of small farmers sold their land to large landowners, and tenant farmers became the norm. Tenant farming means that the small farmers no longer own their own land and they had to rent it. There was also widespread slavery used within the Roman Empire, which made it hard for small farmers to stay in business. because if you're a small farmer and you can't afford to buy slaves, you have to hire people to work, whereas the slaves aren't being paid. And so the large landowners who have a lot of slaves, they have a competitive advantage, and a lot of the small farmers went out of business. Slavery was definitely seen as necessary for the survival of the Roman Empire. As more and more Roman men had to take time away from home to serve in the Roman legions, slaves were really important to keep the economy going. Slaves worked as servants in people's homes. By far the most common job of a slave was farmer, and also they worked in mines, which was really harsh. A lot of slaves died in mines. Greek slaves could even be used as teachers because a lot of them were educated. In the classical period, slavery is different than we think of it, I think, in our history in America, where it was passed down through families. Mostly slaves in this time period were people who were conquered and they were captured as prisoners of war. One of the negatives of slavery for Rome is that it led to less technological innovation than some of the other classical civilizations. So, especially in farming, when Rome needed more food, they just got more and more slaves to grow more and more food and work harder and harder. In other civilizations where there was less slavery, when they needed more food, they had an incentive to try to create new technology or new methods to make farming more productive. In Rome, they tended to just add more slaves, and so they didn't feel that it was as necessary to develop new technologies. Like the other civilizations we've studied in the classical period, Rome was also patriarchal. Paterfamilias means domination of the male head of household. So everyone in the family is supposed to look to the male head of household to make decisions and kind of put their own needs aside for that of the whole family. Women in urban areas sometimes had more influence and sometimes could own property. So in urban areas, it was possible for women to have a little bit more influence and independence, but in general, it's still a patriarchal society. The Romans traded on the Silk Road with India and China, like we've learned before. They really had a strong desire for luxury goods from places like India and China. Silk was extremely popular among the upper class Romans. Roman goods tended to be less desired. Romans didn't produce the same luxury type items that India and China did, so they tended to trade more raw materials or lower end products. The other place Rome traded a lot was on the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see on the map the different trade routes crisscrossing the Mediterranean. Romans sailed as far north as Britain and as far east as the Red Sea. And we know whenever we have trade, we also have cultural diffusion. A good example of this is the stirrup, used for horseback riding, that spread from Central Asia over to Europe. In terms of culture, the Romans copied a lot of Greek culture. Sculpture, especially initially, copied Greek styles. We talked about how the Greeks really tried to portray the ideal human body. One thing I think a lot of people don't realize, these sculptures that we see today as just plain marble from the Greeks and the Romans probably would have been painted in their time. And so you can see here that famous statue of Augustus and then a replica of it, what it may have looked like in its time. Literature within the Roman Empire focused on mythology and history. And the Latin language is also a really important cultural contribution of the Romans. Latin is still used today, and it was used especially in Europe for a long time after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Romans were not really into experimental science as we think of science today, but they definitely were advanced in science and math because they had a lot of engineering and architectural achievements. Roads, aqueducts which carried water into the city, which is pictured on the right, arches, domes, and even concrete. This building here that you see, the frontal view and then the aerial view, is the Pantheon in Rome. Pantheon means many gods, and so this was a temple dedicated to the gods of the Romans. Their buildings were more adorned than the Greeks, but you can see they still had similar styles to the Greeks. The Romans practiced the same religion as the Greeks, they just made the names of the gods different. And we will talk about that in class when we study the Greeks, that the gods were often immoral. They definitely weren't, as we think of in a lot of other religions, like an example of what you should be like or that you should follow. And so it was a pretty impersonal religion. The way that you practiced the religion was by giving offerings to the temple, doing different sacrifices or rituals. It didn't necessarily connect people to the gods with a personal relationship. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Romans were tolerant of different religions, but they also demanded that you worship their gods. And so people could practice other religions as long as they also worship the Roman gods. A new religion sprung up in the Roman Empire, which was Christianity. So Christianity began in the Middle East with Jesus of Nazareth. Christians saw Jesus as the Son of God, called the Messiah. And so he taught that the way to achieve salvation or going to heaven was just through faith and through belief in God and belief that Jesus was the Son of God. He also taught a more personal relationship with God, so people were encouraged to pray to God and have a relationship with God versus just like giving money to a temple like the Romans did with their gods. This also gave hope to the poor because Christianity said that you can go to heaven and have an afterlife by just having faith, not through things that you do. And so this gave hope to the poor because in the Roman religion, if you're very poor and you can't afford to give money to the temple or participate in all these things, you would feel like the gods really aren't going to look favorably on you. But Christianity says it doesn't matter, it's through your faith. Christianity spread through merchant activity, missionaries, and early saints, which are church leaders, and we're going to talk about this more in class and look at some documents and actually look at one of those early church leaders, Paul. Christianity was initially persecuted in Rome, but later became the official religion under the Emperor Constantine around 300 CE. So this map shows you the spread of Christianity just in the 1st century CE. So Christianity started over by Jerusalem. The red lines are the missionary journeys of Paul, who was one of the early Christian leaders, and you can see in a lot of the places that he traveled around, Christianity started to gain a hold. And then this shows you the extent of Christianity between 300 and 600 CE, and you can see it's really taken off. And so this is part of the reason why Constantine made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, because it was a way of uniting people and kind of bringing people together when so many people had already converted to Christianity. We're going to learn a lot more about the downfalls of Rome in class. We're going to study the fall of the classical empires as a separate thing. But these are just some of the reasons that Rome started to decline and eventually fell. A number of plagues came through the Roman Empire, which caused population decline. Whenever we have a lot of people killed for any reason, it starts to slow down the economy and trade because people just aren't working as much. They're not producing as many products. There was a shift in society from philosophy and politics, like lofty intellectual things, to luxury and pleasure-seeking behaviors. A series of corrupt and ineffective emperors, and one of the emperors, Diocletian, tried to save Rome by dividing it in half. You can see on the map here, he divided it into the Western Roman Empire, and Rome was the capital, and then the Eastern Roman Empire, and Constantinople was the capital. Constantine, I mentioned, embraced Christianity as a unifying force, but all of these things didn't prevent Rome from falling. They also spent way too much money on the military, which I talked about before, why that was a necessity to spend more money on the military. The military involved too many non-locals from newly conquered areas, So these are people that had just been conquered by the Romans, and so they maybe weren't as loyal to the Roman Empire as you would want your army to be. Environmental problems like soil erosion and depletion we talked about. And then also a series of invasions led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire around 476 CE. The Eastern Roman Empire continued on as the Byzantine Empire. It was Christian and Greek speaking, and we're going to study the Byzantine Empire as its own place going forward. So this map shows you invasions of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century CE. They come from all different places, but notice that a lot of the invaders come from Northern Europe, the parts of Northern Europe that had not yet been conquered by the Romans. And then this map shows you the 4th and 5th century invasions, which are what really toppled Rome. So notice again, they're coming from a lot of the northern places. These groups overall are called the Germanic tribes, and you can see they have all different names, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Lombards. But what happens here is that they're continually attacking Rome, and the western part just can't keep up. The eastern part was wealthier. It's closer to the Silk Road. It had more trade, and so the eastern part was able to continue on in a smaller capacity, but the western part fell to these invaders in 476. So the eastern part, which is the dark green here, became known as the Byzantine Empire. So this is the eastern part of the empire continuing on, and you can see the western part becomes divided up into all these different groups of those Germanic people from Northern Europe, create their own kingdoms throughout the western part of the Roman Empire.